The morning sun painted golden streaks across the Richardson family's backyard in Columbus, Ohio, casting long shadows that danced between the flowering shrubs and carefully manicured lawn. It was one of those rare late spring days where everything seemed to be in perfect harmony. The sky was a brilliant cerulean blue without a single cloud to mar its beauty, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass. Emma Richardson, a bright-eyed 3-year-old with pigtails and an infectious giggle that could melt even the coldest hearts, was chasing butterflies in her favorite pink sundress. The dress, which had been a gift from her grandmother just 3 weeks prior, twirled around her tiny legs as she ran barefoot across the soft grass, her small fingers reaching toward the delicate insects that fluttered just beyond her grasp. Every few seconds, she would squeal with delight or frustration, performing an adorable little hop that made her look like she was dancing with invisible partners. Sarah Richardson sat on the weathered wooden patio, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee that had been her constant companion for the past hour. She was a single mother, having separated from Emma's father 2 years prior, and these quiet afternoons had become sacred to her, moments of peace in a life that often felt overwhelmingly chaotic. She watched her daughter with the particular kind of attention that only a devoted parent can muster, her eyes tracking Emma's every movement, ready to catch her if she stumbled or to comfort her if she scraped a knee. Sarah's mind was momentarily occupied with thoughts about the upcoming parent-teacher conference at Emma's preschool, the pile of laundry waiting inside, and whether she'd remembered to pay the electric bill. These ordinary, mundane concerns that filled the minds of parents everywhere were the backdrop to what would soon become an extraordinary and life-altering afternoon. Emma's paternal grandmother was stationed near the far end of the yard, tending to her beloved rose garden with the care and attention of someone who had spent a lifetime nurturing living things. At 72 years old, moved with the practiced grace of a woman who understood the value of self-care and purposeful movement. She'd been a dog trainer and behavioral specialist for over 2 decades, retiring just 3 years ago to focus on her garden and her. Her hands, weathered and capable, expertly pruned branches and adjusted the garden hose, sending a fine mist of water across the delicate pink and red blooms. She hummed an old tune, something from her youth, a melody that had stayed with her through decades of life's ups and downs. As she worked, every so often, she would glance over at Emma and smile, her heart full of that particular kind of love that grandparents reserve for their. Had moved in with the family 2 years ago to help Sarah navigate the challenges of single parenthood, and in doing so, she'd formed an unbreakable bond with her granddaughter. The three of them, Sarah, Emma, and created a picture of domestic tranquility that seemed almost too perfect to be real. It was the kind of scene that photographers chase, that artists try to capture on canvas, that people dream about when they imagine what a perfect life should look like. The backyard itself was a small oasis, separated from the outside world by a 5-foot wooden fence that had been painted white just the previous summer. The fence represented security, privacy, and the boundaries between the chaos of the outer world and the peaceful sanctuary they'd created within their home. Inside this enclosed space, they were safe. The world couldn't touch them here, or so they believed. Sarah had stepped inside the house for what was meant to be merely 30 seconds. She needed to grab her phone, which she'd left on the kitchen counter while preparing lunch for Emma. She'd told she would be right back, and had waved her hand in that casual way that suggested nothing of importance would happen in those brief moments. Emma was focused on her butterflies, absorbed in her toddler's universe where nothing else existed except the present moment and the simple joy of play. The back door slid open with its familiar whoosh and clicked shut behind Sarah. The house was quiet inside, cool from the air conditioning, and filled with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television that had been left on in the living room. But in the world beyond the fence, on the streets of Columbus just 3 blocks away, something sinister was unfolding. At the First National Bank on Maple Street, an alarm was blaring. A man had just fled with a bag containing $50,000 in cash, his heart pounding with the adrenaline of criminal action. A 34-year-old man with a history of petty crimes and a growing desperation born from financial ruin had made the decision that would lead him directly into the Richardson family's peaceful afternoon. He'd planned this robbery for months, but his plan had an unexpected flaw. He hadn't accounted for the police response time being faster than he'd anticipated. Officers were already in pursuit before he'd even cleared the parking lot. The sirens started then, distant at first, wailing through the residential neighborhoods of Columbus with that distinctive sound that alerts everyone within earshot that something official and urgent is happening. Police sirens had become part of the ambient noise of suburban life, something that people heard so frequently that they barely registered anymore. Sarah, inside the house, heard the sirens distantly but paid them no real attention, continued humming and watering her roses. Emma, still chasing butterflies, didn't even pause in her play. The sirens grew closer, their wailing intensifying as multiple police vehicles converged on the area, but still, the family in the backyard continued their ordinary afternoon. They had no way of knowing that those sirens were heralding the arrival of a moment that would change their lives forever. Ran through the streets like a man possessed, his athletic frame moving with desperate speed as he weaved between parked cars and cut through residential yards. Behind him, 2 police cars raced down Maple Street, and on foot, with his K-9 partner straining against the leash, Officer pursued the suspect with focused determination. Officer was an experienced police handler, 12 years on the force, 8 of those years working specifically with K-9 units. Duke, his German Shepherd partner, was a 4-year-old dog who had been specifically trained for apprehension and tracking. The dog's muscles rippled beneath his sleek coat, his jaw clenched with the intensity of a predator on the hunt. Duke lived for this, the chase, the pursuit, the moment when training translated into action. Turned left onto Residential Avenue, the street where the Richardson family lived. He could see the backyard fences lining the block, and in his desperation, he spotted what looked like an opportunity. A fence with a gate, possibly unlocked or at least climbable. Without hesitation, driven purely by the instinct to escape and hide, sprinted toward the white-painted fence that bordered the Richardson property. He didn't know whose yard it was. He didn't know that a small child was playing there, that a mother was inside, or that an elderly woman was tending roses. He only knew that he needed to get away, and this fence represented a potential escape route. The world was about to change in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The fence shook violently as launched himself at it with the desperation of a man whose freedom hung in the balance. His hands gripped the top edge of the white wooden fence, and with a grunt of exertion, he pulled himself up and over, his body moving with surprising athleticism despite the panic coursing through his veins. His feet cleared the top rail by mere inches before he began his descent on the other side. The landing was hard. His sneakers hit the soft earth with a thud that reverberated through the quiet sanctuary of the Richardson backyard. He stumbled forward, his arms pinwheeling to maintain his balance, and then he was down, rolling across the grass in an ungraceful tumble that left him breathless and disoriented. His mind raced faster than his body could move. Escape, hide, think. The mantra repeated in his head like a broken record. Had not always been a criminal. 5 years ago, he'd been a maintenance supervisor at a factory, earning a modest but respectable living. Then had come the medical crisis, his sister's sudden illness, the astronomical medical bills, the insurance denials, the mounting debt that spiraled beyond his ability to manage. Desperation had driven him to make increasingly poor choices. First came the small theft from his employer, easily caught and costing him his job. Then came the petty shoplifting, the check fraud, the cascading series of bad decisions that had led him inevitably to this moment. Rolling across someone's backyard with thousands of dollars in a duffel bag and the full weight of the law in pursuit behind him. He was a weak man who had made strong mistakes, And now he was paying the price with every fiber of his being screaming at him to run, hide, escape. On the other side of the fence, Officer heard the impact of the suspect hitting the ground on the other side. He was 38 years old, with 15 years on the police force and 12 of those years working with K-9 units. He'd seen situations escalate and de-escalate. He'd witnessed the incredible power of a well-trained dog to bring a dangerous situation under control. But he'd also seen things go terribly wrong in split seconds. Officer was a thoughtful man, someone who understood that his job wasn't just about enforcement but about safety. The safety of his community, the safety of his partner Duke, and the safety of innocent bystanders. He reached the fence at a sprint, Duke pulling so hard against his leash that the German Shepherd's entire body was straining with the effort to reach the suspect. Officer's free hand gripped the gate latch, and he burst through into the backyard with Duke at his side. Duke was a magnificent specimen of canine excellence. 4 years old, muscular and sleek, with a black and tan coat that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, Duke was more than just a beautiful animal. He was a precision instrument trained to incapacitate threats and protect his handler. His eyes were intense, focused, locked onto his target. His ears were perked forward, his nostrils flared as he caught the scent of adrenaline and fear emanating from. The dog's training had been comprehensive and professional. Duke had learned to respond to hand signals and voice commands. He'd been conditioned to apprehend suspects, to hold them down, to maintain control until other officers arrived. In Duke's mind was not a human being. He was a target, a threat to be neutralized. The dog had no comprehension of desperation or his humanity. He was purely instinctual, purely driven by his training and his bond with his handler. And then Duke began to bark. The sound was thunderous, primal, the full-throated roar of a predator announcing its presence and its intent. It was a sound designed to intimidate, to dominate, to strike fear into the hearts of those who heard it. The barking seemed to shake the very air of the peaceful backyard, shattering the tranquility like a rock through glass. Officer kept the leash tight, maintaining control of the powerful animal even as Duke lunged forward, his paws churning against the grass as he moved toward. "Stop right there!" Officer shouted, his voice commanding and authoritative. "Get down on the ground now." Inside the house, Sarah was holding her phone, staring at the screen to check if she'd missed any important messages or notifications. The barking barely registered at first. It was just noise, the kind of thing that happened in neighborhoods. But then the shouting, the unmistakable sound of urgency and danger, the edge in a masculine voice that was not any voice she recognized, cut through her consciousness like a siren. Her heart skipped a beat. Without conscious thought, driven purely by maternal instinct and the primitive part of her brain that registers threat, Sarah turned toward the sliding glass door that faced the backyard. What she saw through the glass would burn itself into her memory for the rest of her life. There was a strange man in her backyard. There was a police officer. There was a massive dog barking with ferocious intensity. And there was Emma, small, vulnerable, precious Emma, standing frozen in the middle of this chaos like a tiny figure in a nightmare. "Oh God, no, no," Sarah's voice came out as something between a gasp and a scream. She dropped her phone, not even hearing it clatter to the tile floor, and ran toward the sliding glass door. Her hands fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 seconds. The door slid open with a loud whoosh, and she screamed, a mother's scream, the kind of sound that contains all the fear and protective fury that a parent can muster. Emma, get away from there, had also heard the commotion. She'd spun around from her roses, the garden hose still in her hand, spraying water in random directions as she took in the scene. Her 72-year-old heart suddenly felt like it was trying to escape from her chest. She'd lived enough years to recognize danger when she saw it. She'd trained dogs for 20 years and understood aggressive animal behavior. She recognized the intensity in Duke's body language. This was not a friendly encounter. She dropped the hose and began running toward Emma, her aged legs moving faster than they had in years, propelled by adrenaline and love and the fierce protection of grandparent for grandchild. Seeing the police officer and the massive barking dog made the calculation that all desperate men make in moments of extreme stress. He reassessed his options. The fence on the far side of the yard might offer another escape route. He turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the grass, the duffel bag with the stolen money still clutched in his hand. Officer tightened his grip on Duke's leash, calling out commands, trying to maintain control of the situation while ensuring that no one got hurt. But the situation was spiraling. It was becoming increasingly chaotic. There were now 4 beings converging on the small backyard: Officer, Duke, Sarah running from the house and running from the garden. And in the center of this storm, frozen in confusion and growing terror, stood Emma. Emma's small body began to tremble. She didn't understand what was happening. Adults were screaming. A loud dog was barking. A strange man was running. Her safe, predictable world had suddenly become a place of chaos and fear. Her 3-year-old mind struggled to process the rapid escalation of events. Her lower lip began to quiver. She could feel the tension in the air, the urgency, the danger, even though she didn't have the vocabulary or the experience to name it. Officer was moving toward, trying to close the distance, but had seen an opportunity. He turned toward Emma, and in that critical moment, his desperate eyes locked onto the small child. The calculation flickered across his face. A human shield, a hostage, a bargaining chip, began moving toward Emma. It was at this precise moment that everything hung in the balance. Time seemed to move in that peculiar, slow-motion way that it does in moments of extreme crisis. The distance between and Emma was only about 8 feet, but in that stretch of lawn and circumstance lay the thin line between tragedy and miracle. Legs pumped as he moved toward the small girl, his mind working frantically through the possibilities. Sarah's screams echoed across the yard, growing louder and more desperate with each passing millisecond. Was running, her aging body moving with a speed and determination that her years. Officer was shouting commands, both at and at Duke, trying to regain control of a situation that was spinning rapidly beyond his ability to manage it. Duke was barking ferociously, his voice a constant, overwhelming sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself. And Emma stood alone in the center of this maelstrom, her small body trembling, her eyes wide with a fear that no 3-year-old should ever have to experience. Her pink sundress, which had been pristine moments before, now seemed like a tragic detail, the innocence of childhood about to collide with the harsh realities of an adult world. Her hands, which had moments before been reaching toward butterflies, now hung at her sides, clenched into tiny fists. Her mouth opened and closed, as if she wanted to scream but couldn't find her voice. She was paralyzed by the overwhelming sensations assaulting her small nervous system, the loud barking, the shouting, the running, the sense that her safe world had become something terrifying and incomprehensible. Was now only 5 feet away from Emma. Officer was still 15 feet away, the distance between him and the suspect feeling like an impossibly wide gulf given the speed at which events were unfolding. His hand, the one not holding the duffel bag full of stolen money, was already reaching out toward Emma. His mind had made the decision that a desperate man in a desperate situation makes. Emma would become his insurance policy, his bargaining chip, his path to escape. He didn't think about the consequences. He didn't think about the trauma he would inflict. He thought only about himself, about his freedom, about his survival. The calculus of desperation had cleared all other considerations from his mind. But then something extraordinary happened, something that would later be analyzed by psychologists, discussed by dog trainers, debated by parents and teachers, and shared millions of times across the internet. In the midst of the chaos, the barking, the shouting, and the approaching danger, Emma's voice emerged. It was not a scream. It was not a cry for help. It was not the panicked wail of a terrified child. Instead, it was something far more remarkable. Duke said. The words were small, high-pitched, but they possessed a clarity that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. They cut through the chaos like a laser beam through darkness, like a single note of perfect pitch rising above an orchestra playing discordantly. The two words were delivered with a calm certainty that seemed to defy explanation. Emma's tiny voice contained no tremor, no uncertainty, no fear. It was as if she had unconsciously accessed some deep well of composure that existed within her. Later, psychologists would debate whether this was muscle memory from training, whether it was the wisdom of a child who could sense that the dog was the key to survival, or whether it was something even more profound, an instinctual understanding of how fear and calm interact. Officer's mouth fell open, his eyes widened. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to actually pause. Everything hung suspended in a moment of impossible hope and desperate uncertainty. What would happen next? Would the dog respond? Would reach Emma? Would chaos continue to reign? The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would occur. Duke's response was instantaneous and absolute. Despite his training to apprehend, despite his adrenaline, despite the urgency of the pursuit that had occupied his entire being only seconds before, the German shepherd obeyed the command. His powerful body, which had been lunging forward with violent intensity, suddenly stopped mid-stride. His back legs bent and his haunches made contact with the grass. He sat, completely, perfectly, obediently. The massive dog's barking ceased mid-bark, cut off as abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His tail, which had been rigid and aggressive, began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. More remarkably, Duke's focus shifted entirely to Emma. The dog's eyes, which had been locked onto the fleeing suspect with predatory intensity, now turned to look at the small girl with what could only be described as recognition and respect. It was as if the dog understood, in some way that transcended conventional animal psychology, that this small human had just communicated with him in a way that bypassed all of his training and spoke directly to some deeper part of his consciousness. Later, Officer would struggle to explain this moment to other officers, to reporters, to his own family. How could a police dog, specifically trained for apprehension, suddenly shift his allegiance and his focus based on a command from a 3-year-old he'd never met before? The answer, which Officer would eventually come to understand through extensive conversations with, was that Duke had responded not to command but to a tone. Emma had spoken with absolute calm, without fear, without aggression, and without the desperate urgency that had been radiating. Her voice had carried an authority that came not from dominance but from peace. Animals, Duke included, are remarkably sensitive to the emotional states of humans. They can detect fear, aggression, desperation, and calm with an accuracy that often surpasses human perception. Emma's calm had reached something in Duke that all of Officer's training had not been able to activate in that moment of crisis. Froze mid-stride. The dog he had been about to use as an excuse to grab the child, the threat that he had been about to claim had forced him to seize Emma as a hostage, had suddenly become harmless. More than harmless, the dog was now sitting peacefully beside the small child, almost protectively. His mind reeled. His escape route had evaporated. His contingency plan had failed before he'd even executed it. He was standing in a backyard, holding a duffel bag full of stolen money, with a calm police dog between him and the child, an officer now closing the distance rapidly, and 2 women running toward him with the fury of those who had just seen their worst fear averted by miracle. Sarah reached the sliding glass door frame and stopped, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with the overwhelming relief and residual terror of a mother who had just watched her child in mortal danger. Slowed her running, her aged hand pressed against her chest as her heart hammered against her ribs. Officer, with his eyes still locked on the impossible scene before him, quickly closed the remaining distance. His tactical training took over. He moved swiftly toward, his body language professional and controlled, his movements economical and efficient. Didn't resist. He dropped the duffel bag. He fell to his knees. He placed his hands on the back of his head, the universal gesture of surrender. He was crying, tears streaming down his face, not out of remorse for his actions, but out of the overwhelming shock of the moment, and the realization that he had been stopped by a 3-year-old girl and her 2 simple words. Officer was upon him in seconds, cuffing him, reciting his Miranda rights, securing him. But even as he did so, his eyes kept drifting to Emma, who was now gently petting Duke's head, her small fingers running through the dog's soft fur. The police dog, for his part, seemed completely content to be touched by this small human who had somehow understood him at a moment when understanding had seemed impossible. The aftermath of crisis often feels like stepping into an alternate reality where the rules of the world have fundamentally shifted. Officer knelt beside Emma Richardson, with his hands trembling so violently that he had to clasp them together to hide the visible shaking. 12 years of police work, hundreds of difficult situations, multiple commendations for valor. None of it had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. His mind was racing through possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. He'd secured with professional efficiency, reading him his rights in a calm voice that belied the inner turmoil churning within his chest. Other officers were arriving on scene now, sirens wailing in the distance, creating a cacophony that seemed oddly distant and muffled, as if Officer were experiencing everything through water. Sarah had rushed out of the house and immediately swept Emma into her arms, holding her daughter so tightly that Emma whimpered in protest. Sarah's tears flowed freely, not just from relief that her daughter was safe, but from the overwhelming emotional release of having stood on the precipice of unimaginable tragedy and been pulled back by forces she couldn't comprehend. She buried her face in Emma's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's apple-scented shampoo, grounding herself in the reality that Emma was alive, whole, and in her arms. Stood nearby, her hands pressed against her face, her shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that come from the depths of a soul that has just experienced the closest possible brush with devastating loss. Officer was the first to recover enough to ask the question that was burning in his mind. He approached Emma gently, his professional demeanor softened by the awe and confusion he was experiencing. Sarah, still holding Emma, looked at the officer with an expression that was part gratitude, part confusion, part residual terror. Officer knelt down so that he was at Emma's eye level, and he asked the question that would reverberate through the next several months of his life, that would haunt him, fascinate him, and ultimately transform his entire philosophy of police work. Emma, how did you know to tell Duke to sit? The question hung in the air for a moment. Emma looked at Officer with the direct, uncomplicated gaze that only children can manage. Her thumb had found its way into her mouth, a regression to a more infantile state brought on by the trauma of the experience. She was exhausted, confused, and emotionally drained in a way that her 3-year-old mind couldn't fully process, but she still managed to answer with a clarity that seemed impossible for a child who had just experienced such terror. Doggy was scared, Emma said simply, her words slightly muffled by her thumb. He needed help. Officer felt something shift profoundly within his chest, a crack in a foundation of understanding that he had built over 12 years of working with police dogs. He had always approached his relationship with Duke as one of handler and partner, with clear hierarchies and established protocols. He gave commands and Duke obeyed. He was the leader, and Duke was the follower. He was the one with the intelligence and training, and Duke was the one with the instinct and physical capability. But in that single moment, with a 3-year-old girl explaining her actions with stunning simplicity, Officer realized that he might have been approaching the entire relationship fundamentally wrong. Emma continued to pet Duke gently, her small fingers running through the German shepherd's black and tan coat. Duke, for his part, seemed to have completely forgotten about the chase, about his training and his purpose. The dog was simply present with Emma, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes soft and focused entirely on the small child who had somehow communicated with him at a frequency that Officer had never quite managed. It was as if Emma had spoken to Duke in a language that transcended the usual verbal commands, a language of pure, uncomplicated emotion and understanding. Having regained some of her composure, approached Officer. She looked at the police officer with eyes that held both sadness and a knowing kind of wisdom. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling that still ran through her body, "may I explain something about Emma?" Officer looked at with a mixture of curiosity and desperation. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a revelation that might change how he understood his entire career. "Please," he said simply. Spent the next 10 minutes explaining her training methodology, the daily lessons she'd been giving Emma, the picture books and games, the focus on communication rather than control. She talked about how she'd built Emma's confidence around animals by helping her understand their emotions and needs. She explained that she'd specifically taught Emma that dogs respond better to calm authority than to fearful commands, because fear in one being transfers to another being. She described her philosophy, that the most effective way to work with animals isn't through dominance or harsh training techniques, but through genuine understanding of the animal's emotional and psychological state. As spoke, Officer began to understand the miraculous impossibility of what had just occurred. It wasn't that Emma was a magical 3-year-old with superhuman abilities. It was that she had been educated in something that Officer, with all his professional training and experience, had overlooked: the art of genuine communication with another living being. Emma hadn't commanded Duke with authority derived from dominance or control. She had spoken to him with calm certainty that came from a place of genuine concern for his. She had recognized that Duke was afraid, just as much as she was afraid, and instead of letting fear compound fear, she had chosen to offer calm to address the fear. Officer stood there, listening to, watching Emma continue to pet Duke, and experiencing what could only be described as a professional and philosophical awakening. He thought about all the times he'd pulled hard on Duke's leash, all the times he'd given commands with the expectation of immediate obedience, all the times he'd treated the relationship as one of dominance and control. He thought about how many situations might have been handled differently if he'd approached them with Emma's simple wisdom, recognizing the fear in the animal and responding with calm rather than aggression. Other officers arrived and began securing the scene. Was being loaded into a police vehicle, his hands cuffed behind him, his head bowed in defeat and shock. The duffel bag with the stolen money was being logged into evidence. The backyard that had been so peaceful just 30 minutes before was now a crime scene, complete with police tape and official procedures. But in the center of all this official activity, Emma continued to pet Duke. An Officer continued to stand beside, his entire understanding of his work being fundamentally reorganized in real time. Sarah, still holding Emma, approached Officer. "Officer, I don't know how to thank you," she began, but Officer held up his hand gently. "Ma'am, you don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "Your mother-in-law and your daughter just taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." He looked at Emma, and then at Duke, and then back at, "I'm going to be thinking about this moment for the rest of my career." Reached out and placed a weathered hand on Officer's arm. She understood what he was experiencing, the moment when a single experience cracks open your worldview and forces you to rebuild your understanding of something fundamental. She'd experienced it many times during her 2 decades of working with animals, the moments when you realize that your previous approach had been based on incomplete understanding. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the Richardson backyard once more, Officer stood witness to something profound. The moment when professional certainty gave way to humility, when 12 years of training encountered the wisdom of a 3-year-old girl and her grandmother, and when a police dog became something more than a tool. He became a bridge between the old understanding and the new one about to emerge. Had been washing dishes in her kitchen when she heard the first sounds of commotion filtering through her open window. At 87 years old, had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. She'd watched children grow up on these quiet streets, seen families come and go, witnessed the slow transformation of her once quiet suburb into something more vibrant and unpredictable. She developed an almost instinctive sense for when something unusual was happening nearby. The sirens, the shouting, the strange dog barking with an intensity that seemed almost preternatural, all of it, had caught her attention in a way that the usual neighborhood sounds did not. Was the kind of woman who had embraced technology in her later years, not because she was particularly tech-savvy, but because she enjoyed documenting moments and sharing them with her who lived 3 states away. She kept her smartphone on the counter, always within arm's reach. When she saw the chaos unfolding in the Richardson backyard through her kitchen window, something told her to record it. Perhaps it was journalistic instinct left over from her younger years when she'd worked as a newspaper editor. Perhaps it was simply the instinct of someone who understood that moments of importance should be preserved. Whatever the reason, dried her hands on her apron, grabbed her phone, and positioned herself at the window. Her aging hands weren't entirely steady. She had a slight tremor that came with age, but she managed to hit the record button just in time to capture the moment when the man in the hoodie crashed into the Richardsons' yard. She recorded Officer bursting through the gate with Duke straining against the leash. She recorded the chaos, the barking, the running, and then, the moment that would change everything. She recorded Emma's small voice cutting through the cacophony with those 2 perfect words, "Duke, sit." She recorded the impossible moment when the police dog, trained for aggression and apprehension, suddenly became still. She recorded the dog's immediate obedience and the subsequent capture of the suspect. Continued recording for another minute after Officer had successfully restrained, capturing the arrival of additional police units, the securing of the scene, and Emma standing in the midst of it all, petting Duke with the innocent grace of a child who had just performed a miracle without fully understanding what she had done. When the recording finished, stood at her window for several long moments, her phone still in her trembling hands, understanding that she had just witnessed something extraordinary. That evening sat at her small desk in her bedroom, her reading glasses perched on her nose, and carefully uploaded the video to her social media account. She'd never been one for dramatic captions or sensationalism. She simply typed, "A brave 3-year-old saved the day today. This happened in my neighborhood. Incredible." She included 3 emojis, a heart, a police officer, and a dog, and then hit post. Went to bed that night with no idea that the simple act of sharing what she'd witnessed would trigger a cascade of events that would ripple across the entire internet. By morning, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. By noon, it had 500,000 views. News outlets began picking it up. Local Columbus News ran the story with the headline, "3-year-old girl calms police dog during dramatic arrest." By evening, the story had spread to regional news networks. CNN picked it up the following morning with the headline, "Toddler's 2-word stop dangerous chase." By that point, the video had over 10 million views. Twitter was ablaze with the hashtag #BraveEmma. Facebook groups were forming dedicated to discussing the incident. Threads were analyzing every frame of the video, speculating about how a 3-year-old could have possibly known a police dog command. The story had all the elements that make content go viral: a child, danger, an animal, a miraculous resolution, and the fundamental human appeal of witnessing the impossible captured on video. But beyond the sensationalism, there was something deeper that resonated with people. It was the image of a small child, confronted with overwhelming fear and danger, responding not with panic but with calm. It was the evidence of innocence and wisdom existing simultaneously in one small human being. It was the suggestion that sometimes the answers to our most difficult problems come from unexpected sources, from people we least expect to have wisdom to offer. Major news outlets began camping outside the Richardson family's home by the following morning. Sarah opened her front door to find news vans lining the street, satellite dishes extending toward the sky, and reporters with perfectly coiffed hair and sharp suits positioning themselves for their live segments. The Richardson family had suddenly become the center of a media storm that they never anticipated and didn't particularly want. Sarah's phone began ringing constantly. Interview requests from morning shows, from evening news programs, from podcasts and YouTube channels. Her email filled with messages from people claiming to represent various news organizations. Emma's face appeared on televisions across America. The image of her small form in her pink sundress, petting Duke while police secured the scene, became iconic. News articles ran with headlines like "3-year-old's instinct stops violent suspect" and "Police dog responds to toddler's command in viral video." Late-night hosts joked about it during their monologues. Social media influencers created reaction videos. People who had never heard of Columbus, Ohio, or the Richardson family suddenly felt deeply connected to their story. Who had spent her entire life working quietly in the background, training dogs and living a modest existence, suddenly found herself being called by news producers who wanted her perspective on the incident. At 72 years old, she had never sought the spotlight, and the sudden attention was overwhelming and somewhat uncomfortable. But she also understood that this was an opportunity to educate people about her philosophy of animal training, about the importance of teaching children to understand animals as emotional beings rather than threats or tools. Officer was contacted by the police department's public relations office and asked to participate in interviews. The department wanted to capitalize on the positive publicity. Here was a story about police doing good, about a police dog that had responded appropriately despite the chaos, about a successful apprehension and the safety of an innocent child. It was a public relations dream, but Officer was distracted. He kept thinking about Emma's words, about the philosophical implications of what he'd witnessed. He participated in the interviews, but his answers often veered into discussions about police dog training methods and the nature of animal communication, topics that the public relations team had not anticipated and didn't particularly know how to handle. Sitting in his jail cell awaiting trial, became aware of his role in the viral story. He watched the news coverage from the cell block television, seeing himself portrayed as the villain in a story about a brave child and a faithful dog. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become famous for the worst moment of his life, remembered forever as the criminal who had been stopped by a 3-year-old girl. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical punishment could have. Over the coming weeks and months, would write a letter to Emma, expressing remorse not just for his crime but for what he'd put her through, and apologizing to her for forcing her to grow up in a way that no 3-year-old should have to. The viral moment, while overwhelming for the Richardson family, had created something unexpected, a global conversation about courage, about childhood wisdom, about the nature of communication between humans and animals. Therapists and psychologists began discussing Emma's response as a case study in trauma response and emotional intelligence. Dog trainers started questioning their own methodologies. Parents began thinking differently about how they taught their children to interact with animals. Teachers incorporated the story into lessons about bravery and compassion. The woman who had recorded the video found herself moderately famous in her own right. News outlets wanted to interview her, to understand why she'd been filming, what had possessed her to capture the moment. She gave interviews from her living room, explaining that she'd simply felt something important happening and had wanted to preserve it. She never anticipated that her simple act of documentation would help launch a story that would inspire and influence millions of people around the world. The Richardson backyard, which had been a place of trauma and chaos just days before, became a pilgrimage site of sorts. People who had seen the video wanted to visit, to stand in the place where the miracle had occurred. The family had to install a gate to maintain their privacy, but they understood the impulse. Something sacred had happened there, something that transcended the ordinary mechanics of daily life. The place where fear had been transformed into calm, where danger had been met with compassion, where a small child had done something that logical explanation. 2 weeks after the viral video first appeared on the internet, a journalist named David from the Columbus Dispatch was sitting in his office, staring at the story that everyone was talking about but that no one seemed to have fully investigated. The public narrative was compelling. A 3-year-old girl with miraculous instincts had somehow known to command a police dog, defying logical explanation and suggesting something almost supernatural about the child. But David, with 20 years of investigative journalism behind him, had developed a keen sense for incomplete stories. He understood that there was always more beneath the surface, always context that changed how you understood the narrative. He decided to dig deeper. David began by researching. He made phone calls, conducted interviews, and within 48 hours, had uncovered the truth that transformed the story from one of miraculous coincidence into one of deliberate, loving, patient education. He discovered that had spent 20 years as a certified dog trainer and behavioral specialist. He found records of her work, testimonials from clients, documentation of the specialized training she'd conducted. He spoke to former clients who described as a visionary in the field of humane animal training. He learned about her philosophy, one that emphasized understanding the animal's emotional and psychological state rather than relying on dominance-based training techniques. Most importantly, David interviewed extensively about her relationship with Emma and how the 3-year-old had come to know police dog commands. Initially reluctant to speak to the media, eventually opened up to David because she recognized that he was genuinely interested in understanding the truth rather than simply perpetuating a sensational narrative. She described her daily lessons with Emma, the picture books they looked at together, the games they played, the way she'd carefully introduced Emma to dog behavior and communication. She talked about how she'd chosen to teach Emma that dogs were emotional beings with their own fears and needs, rather than threats to be avoided or tools to be used. Explained her reasoning. I wanted Emma to grow up understanding that calm authority comes not from dominance but from genuine concern for another beings. I taught her the commands not as weapons, but as a language of communication. When I taught her sit, I explained that this was a way to help the dog feel safe by giving him clarity and structure. Most people think dog training is about control, but I've always believed it's about communication. When David published his article, The Truth Behind the Video, how a grandmother's 20-year philosophy created a 3-year-old hero, it reframed the entire narrative. The story was no longer about a miraculous coincidence. It was about the profound and long-term impact of deliberate education. It was about a grandmother who had spent 2 decades learning how to communicate effectively with animals, and who had chosen to pass that knowledge on to her granddaughter, not because she anticipated a crisis, but because she believed it was important for children to understand animals and develop confidence around them. The revelation sparked a new wave of interest in the story, but this time, the focus was different. Instead of celebrating Emma's impossible instincts, people began to appreciate her wisdom and dedication. Universities reached out too, wanting her to lecture about her training methodologies. Dog training organizations requested interviews and consulting opportunities. Parents contacted her wanting advice about how to teach their own children about animal behavior. The story became less about the miracle and more about the method, less about luck and more about love and patience. Sarah Richardson, Emma's mother, found herself emotional when she fully understood the implications of what had been doing. She realized that her mother-in-law hadn't simply been occupying Emma's time with stories and games, had been systematically building her granddaughter's confidence, her understanding of animal psychology, and her capacity to remain calm in stressful situations. Every single day, without Sarah fully grasping what was happening, had been preparing Emma in ways that would prove. The relationship between Sarah and deepened significantly during this period. Sarah began asking more detailed questions about her training philosophy. She started participating in some of the daily lessons with Emma, learning alongside her granddaughter. She began to understand that the approach to dog training was really an approach to understanding living beings. It was applicable not just to animals, but to humans as well. The three generations of women, Sarah and Emma, began to form an even bond, united by this new understanding of what had actually been happening in their backyard lessons. Officer learned about the revelation through the news article, and it provided him with the missing piece of the puzzle that had been bothering him since the incident. He requested a meeting with, and over coffee and a quiet, walked Officer through her training philosophy in detail. She explained her approach to K-9 handling, describing how she'd worked with police departments before retiring. She talked about how she believed many police dogs could be trained more effectively if handlers understood the dog's emotional state, rather than simply focusing on obedience commands. Officer listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested his entire professional framework was being reorganized. When finished explaining her philosophy, Officer asked a question that revealed how deeply the incident had affected him. "If you were training me to work with Duke, what would you tell me to do differently?" Considered the question carefully before answering. "I would tell you to stop thinking of yourself as Duke's commander and start thinking of yourself as his partner. I would tell you to pay more attention to his emotional state than to his obedience record. I would tell you that the most effective way to control an animal in a crisis isn't through harsh commands but through genuine calm. And I would tell you that sometimes the people with the least training, like your 3-year-old neighbor, can teach you the most profound lessons if you're humble enough to listen." That conversation would prove to be the catalyst for Officer's professional transformation. He began consulting with about restructuring his K-9 training protocols. He started keeping a detailed journal about Duke's behavior in different situations, noting correlations between his own emotional state and Duke's responses. He discovered, through careful observation, that on days when he came to work stressed and anxious, Duke was more aggressive and reactive. On days when Officer deliberately practiced calm breathing and approached his work with a peaceful mindset, Duke was more responsive and controlled. Within 3 months of the article's publication, Officer had presented a proposal to the Ohio Police Department suggesting significant changes to K-9 training protocols. The proposal emphasized psychological de-escalation, emotional awareness, and a philosophy of partnership rather than dominance. It included specific recommendations for how handlers should approach stressful situations, breathing techniques, emotional regulation strategies, and methods for communicating calm to their animals. The proposal faced initial resistance from some of the older officers who had grown up with traditional, more aggressive training methods. But Officer had something powerful on his side: evidence. He presented data from his own work with Duke showing improved performance, fewer incidents of overaggression, and better overall outcomes in apprehension situations. He presented case studies, research, and most importantly, he presented the story of Emma Richardson and what her 3-year-old wisdom had taught him about the nature of animal communication. Story became studied in police academies and dog training schools across the country. Universities began reaching out to invite her to speak about her training philosophy. At 72 years old, found herself embarking on a second career as an educator and consultant, not because she had sought it out, but because the world had suddenly recognized the value of what she'd been doing quietly for 2 decades. The hidden connection: that Emma's knowledge came not from miraculous instinct but from patient, loving education, transformed the story from one of chance into one of causality. It demonstrated that preparation, education, and a deep understanding of how beings communicate could create conditions where remarkable things became possible. It showed that sometimes the most profound impacts come not from dramatic moments, but from the quiet, daily dedication of someone who believes in building something meaningful, even when they have no idea how their efforts will ultimately be used. 6 months after the incident in the Richardson backyard, Officer stood before an auditorium filled with police officers, K-9 handlers, and police academy instructors from across Ohio. The conference room was austere, decorated in the typical institutional gray and blue colors that government buildings seem to favor. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating that particular kind of artificial brightness that made everything feel slightly unreal. Officer held a clicker in his hand, ready to advance through a PowerPoint presentation that represented months of research, observation, and professional transformation. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been nervous in years. Nervous because he was about to challenge the fundamental assumptions that had guided his career for the past 12 years. 12 years ago, Officer began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach, I received Duke as my K-9 partner. I attended the standard training programs. I learned the commands, the protocols, the hierarchy of handler and dog. I learned that the most effective way to work with a police dog was through clear command structure and immediate obedience. I believed that my job was to be the leader, and Duke's job was to follow my lead. For 12 years, this philosophy worked adequately. Duke was a good police dog. We had successful apprehensions. We had good arrest records. Officer paused, allowing his words to settle into the minds of his audience. He could see officers in the audience nodding, recognizing themselves in his description. He continued, but 6 months ago, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about animal communication and police dog handling. A 3-year-old girl said 2 words to Duke, and the impact was more profound than anything I had accomplished in 12 years of training and handling. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a still frame from his video, Duke sitting perfectly obedient beside Emma, his tail wagging, his entire demeanor transformed from aggressive to peaceful. Officer described the incident in detail, walking through the timeline, explaining the situation, and then asking the critical question. How did a 3-year-old girl accomplish what I, as a trained police officer with 12 years of experience, could not accomplish in that moment? How did she access a level of obedience and calmness in Duke that seemed impossible given the circumstances? The answer, Officer explained, lay in understanding the fundamental difference between command and communication. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a quote from, "The most effective way to influence an animal isn't through force or dominance, but through genuine understanding of their emotional state and calm authority that comes from a place of peace rather than fear." That 3-year-old girl, Officer continued, understood something that I didn't understand despite my 12 years of professional training. She understood that Duke was scared. She recognized that his aggressive barking and lunging forward wasn't really about aggression. It was about fear manifesting as aggression. She responded not with her own fear or with commands delivered from a place of urgency, but with calm authority that communicated to Duke, "You are safe. I understand you. Everything is going to be okay." Officer went on to describe his conversations with and the psychological principles underlying her training philosophy. He explained that animals don't just respond to words, they respond to the emotional states of the humans around them. A dog can sense anxiety, stress, and fear in his handler, and those emotional states get transmitted to the dog, creating a feedback loop of escalating tension. Conversely, a handler who maintains genuine calm and approaches a situation with a peaceful mindset can transmit that calm to his dog, creating de-escalation rather than escalation. I began experimenting with these principles, Officer said, advancing to a slide showing comparative data. I changed my approach to working with Duke. Instead of thinking of myself as his commander, I started thinking of myself as his partner. I began practicing breathing techniques and emotional regulation before high-stress situations. I started paying more attention to Duke's emotional state than to his obedience record, and the results have been remarkable. The data he presented showed measurable improvements, fewer incidents of overaggression, better performance in apprehension situations, fewer complaints about excessive force, and better overall outcomes in police dog deployments. Officer presented case studies of situations where his new approach to handling Duke had resulted in successful apprehensions with minimal force and no injuries to civilians or handlers. "What I'm suggesting," Officer said, looking directly at the audience, "is not that we abandon training standards or lower our expectations for police dog performance. What I'm suggesting is that we fundamentally restructure how we think about the relationship between handler and dog. I'm suggesting that we incorporate training in emotional awareness, psychological de-escalation, and communication-based methodology into our police dog programs. I'm suggesting that we recognize that the handler's emotional state directly impacts the dog's performance, and therefore, handler training is just as important as dog training." Officer went on to present his formal proposal for restructuring K-9 training protocols across Ohio. The proposal included specific recommendations: monthly training in breathing techniques and emotional regulation for all K-9 handlers, psychological evaluations to ensure that handlers were emotionally suited for the work, incorporation of communication-based training methodology into police dog programs, and ongoing consultation with behavioral specialists to ensure that training protocols remained aligned with modern understanding of animal psychology. "Some of you might be thinking," Officer said, addressing the skepticism he could sense in the room, "that this is too soft, too touchy-feely for police work. But I would argue that this is the opposite of soft. This is harder. It requires that we examine our own emotional patterns, that we develop greater self-awareness, that we approach our work with humility and openness to new ideas. It requires that we recognize that a 3-year-old girl and a retired dog trainer have wisdom to teach us about communication and calm authority." The proposal faced immediate and vocal resistance. Senior officers who had built their careers on traditional training methods pushed back. Some argued that the approach was untested. Others suggested that it would make officers soft and less effective. A few questioned whether his philosophy was really compatible with the aggressive nature of police work. But Officer had something powerful on his side: the data, the compelling story, and most importantly, the evidence that his new approach actually worked better than traditional methods. Over the following months, Officer became a fact ambassador for the new training philosophy. He gave presentations at other police departments throughout Ohio and neighboring states. He worked with to develop a comprehensive training curriculum incorporating her principles into police dog handling. He began mentoring other K-9 handlers, helping them make the transition from command-based to communication-based methodology. Now in her mid-70s, found herself working more intensely than she had during her formal career as a dog trainer. Universities invited her to speak. Police departments consulted with her about restructuring their programs. She developed a certification program for police officers interested in becoming K-9 handlers using her methodology. She published her first book, Beyond Command: The Art of Communication Between Handler and K-9, which became required reading in several police academies. Duke, the police dog who had been at the center of the entire story, became something of a symbol of this new approach. He continued his work as a police dog, but with a handler who now understood him in a fundamentally different way. Officer began bringing Duke to training sessions where other officers could observe and learn. The dog became living proof that calm authority and genuine communication could create a more effective working relationship than dominance-based training ever could. The transformation in police dog training across Ohio became a model that other states began to study and adapt. What had started as one officer's personal revelation in a suburban backyard had become the catalyst for institutional and philosophical change across law enforcement. The miracle that had seemed impossible in a moment of crisis, a police dog responding to the calm authority of a small child, became the foundation for a new understanding of how humans and animals could communicate, cooperate, and work together more effectively. Officer would later reflect that the greatest gift Emma Richardson had given him wasn't just the moment itself, but the permission to question his assumptions and the humility to learn from an unexpected source. He had learned that wisdom doesn't always come from credentials and experience. Sometimes it comes from a retired dog trainer who loved her granddaughter and wanted to teach her how to see the fear in others, even in animals trained for danger. 3 years after that fateful afternoon in the Richardson backyard, the ripple effects of Emma Richardson's 2 words had spread far beyond the neighborhood where it all began. The changes initiated by Officer and supported by had become woven into the fabric of police training across multiple states. The Ohio Police Department formally adopted the new K-9 training protocols, and within 2 years, 17 other states had followed suit. What had started as one officer's personal quest to understand an impossible moment had become a movement, a quiet, methodical movement that was reshaping how law enforcement agencies approached animal training and handler psychology. The Richardson family, meanwhile, had learned to navigate their unexpected fame and the enduring public interest in their story. Emma, now 6 years old, had started first grade at elementary school, where she was known by her classmates as the brave girl from the video. Some children treated her with a kind of reverence that made Sarah uncomfortable, as if her daughter were a celebrity rather than a normal kid who liked dinosaurs and chocolate milk. But Emma, with the resilience of childhood, seemed to take it in stride. She didn't fully understand why people were interested in what she'd done. In her mind, she'd simply told Duke to sit because she knew he was scared and needed help. The fact that it had become a national story seemed almost incomprehensible to her. Sarah had quit her part-time job to manage the various opportunities and requests that continued to come through their contact information. Interview requests, speaking engagement offers, and invitations to share their story had become nearly overwhelming. But Sarah had learned to be selective, choosing only the opportunities that felt authentic and meaningful. She'd become an advocate for children's education about animal behavior, giving talks at schools and community centers about how this approach could be taught to children as a fundamental life skill. At 75 years old, had become something of an elder statesman in the fields of animal behavior and police training. She maintained a busy schedule of consulting, teaching, and speaking engagements. She'd established the Foundation for Humane Animal Training, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting communication-based methodologies in animal training across the country. The foundation offered scholarships to young people interested in becoming dog trainers, grants to police departments implementing new training protocols, and educational materials for parents and teachers about teaching children to understand and communicate with animals. But perhaps the most meaningful development in life was her relationship with Officer and Duke. What had started as a professional consultation had evolved into a genuine friendship. Officer visited the Richardson home once a month, and later, twice a month, and eventually it became a weekly ritual. He would bring Duke, and the police dog would spend time playing with Emma in the backyard where their story had begun. Duke was aging. Police dogs don't have the extended working careers that some people imagine. An Officer began to contemplate what would happen when Duke eventually had to retire from active service. That conversation happened one autumn afternoon, about 2.5 years after the original incident. Officer was sitting on the Richardsons' patio, watching Emma and Duke play together. The girl was now 5 years old, and the dog was nearly 7, both at transition points in their lives. Emma was preparing to start kindergarten, and Duke was showing signs that his active police work was coming to an end. Officer turned to and Sarah, who were sitting nearby, and asked a question that had been forming in his mind for months. "When Duke retires," Officer said carefully, "would your family consider giving him a home here? I think he'd be happier spending his final years with Emma than living with me after all the intensity of police work." Sarah's eyes widened and she looked at who smiled with the knowing expression of someone who had anticipated this question, reached over and squeezed Officer's arm gently. "We've been hoping you would ask that," said. "Emma talks about Duke constantly. She asks when he's coming to visit. I think this would be wonderful for all of them." Emma, overhearing the conversation, squealed with delight and ran over to Officer, throwing her arms around him in an enthusiastic hug. "Really? Duke is going to live with us? Forever?" Her joy was uncomplicated and infectious. Officer felt tears forming in his eyes as he hugged Emma back. 6 months later, on a warm spring day that felt almost like it was mirroring the day of the original incident, Officer arrived at the Richardson home with Duke for the last time as an active police officer and his K-9 partner. Duke was officially retired from service, his 15-year career as a police dog coming to an honorable end. Officer had arranged for a small, private ceremony, but what was supposed to be a quiet transition became something more meaningful when neighbors began arriving, drawn by the significance of the moment. The woman who had recorded the original video came with flowers. Several police officers that Officer had mentored came to pay their respects to Duke. David, the journalist who had uncovered story, came to document the moment. Emma, now 6 years old, stood with her hand resting on Duke's head as Officer officially signed over the dog's care and legal ownership to the Richardson family. The police dog, who had spent his entire adult life responding to commands and pursuing suspects, settled onto the Richardsons' backyard grass with a contented sigh. Officer knelt beside Emma and Duke one final time, and the image, a police officer, a police dog, and a small girl in a backyard, would later become one of the most iconic photographs of the entire story. It captured something profound: the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, the transformation of danger into peace, and the enduring power of connection between humans and animals. The bank robber who had set the entire chain of events in motion received word of Duke's retirement from prison. He wrote another letter to Emma, this time expressing profound gratitude that the dog who had prevented him from taking her as a hostage would now have a peaceful, loving retirement. The letter was forwarded to Emma through Sarah, and while Emma didn't fully understand the context, she understood that it was an important piece of the larger story that had defined her early childhood. Over the following 5 years, Emma grew up with Duke as a constant presence in her life. They played together, napped together, and formed the kind of bond that exists between a child and an animal that has been deeply meaningful. Duke lived out his remaining years in comfort and love, his former life as a police dog replaced by a simpler existence of afternoon naps, gentle play, and the unconditional affection of a child who loved him completely. When Duke passed away at the age of 15, Emma grieved deeply, but she also understood, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess, that Duke had had a good life and that she had been privileged to be a part of it. The story of Emma Richardson and the police dog became something greater than the original incident. It became a case study in how one moment of courage and compassion could ripple outward, changing training protocols across the country, inspiring new approaches to animal handling, transforming a police officer's philosophy, launching an elderly dog trainer into a new career, and teaching millions of people about the power of remaining calm in chaos. It became a story about how wisdom can come from unexpected sources, how children can teach adults profound lessons, and how sometimes the most important things we do are the quiet, daily acts of love and education that prepare us for moments we never anticipate. Emma Richardson grew up knowing that on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when she was 3 years old, she had done something extraordinary. But more importantly, she grew up understanding that the real miracle wasn't the moment itself. It was the years of patient teaching that had prepared her for that moment. She learned from her grandmother that education, compassion, and genuine understanding of other beings were the foundations upon which courageous action could be built. She learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is remain calm when fear surrounds you, And that calmness, combined with genuine concern for another beings, can transform danger into peace. Continued her work well into her 80s, mentoring trainers and handlers, writing, consulting, and teaching. She never sought the spotlight, but the spotlight found her because her wisdom had proven to be genuine and transformative. Officer became a national speaker on K-9 training and handler psychology. The accidental documentarian became a symbol of how ordinary people could contribute to extraordinary moments simply by paying attention and having the courage to share what they'd witnessed. And Emma Richardson grew up knowing that she had changed the world, one calm word at a time, in a backyard in Columbus, Ohio, on an afternoon that no one could have predicted, but that everyone would eventually remember. The end.